Ryder. I'm standing in the vestibule of the county courthouse, and one of the most exciting trials in recent months is about to begin. Bjorn Faulkner, a self-made millionaire, has apparently thrown himself off the balcony of his lavishly appointed legendary penthouse. But after further investigation, more and more evidence has started to build up to the conclusion that he was actually murdered by his former secretary and one-time mistress, Karen Andre. This speculation is sure to play itself out in the coming testimony ahead. This is an extremely high-profile case, and Karen has achieved virtual celebrity status by having been accused of the murder of this man. We will continue to bring you live coverage of this exciting trial as it happens. Reporting live from District 1 Courthouse, Don Wilson, WBNC. Back to the studio on you, Ryder.
Court attention. Superior Court number 11 of the State of New York, the Honorable Judge William Heath presiding.
Morning, Mr. Flynn.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Morning, Your Honor.
People of the State of New York versus Karen Andre.
Ready, Your Honor?
Ready, Your Honor.
The clerk will select a jury.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are to be the jurors in this case. 12 of you will be drawn to perform this duty. When I call your name, kindly step up here, take a seat to receive your instructions from Judge Heath. John Hoffman, Jack Paraventi, Steve Weiland, Nola Alterio, Chris Caius, Mary Paraventi, Mary Cover, Harold Levine, Tom Burke, Steve Reiser, Leonard Beringhouse, Joan Segedy. Diane Hyland.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You are the jurors who will try this case. At its close, you'll retire to the jury room and cast your ballots as to the verdict. At the end of each day's session, remain seated until the bailiff or the clerk escorts you to the jury room. Now, my pre-trial instructions to you are to listen to all the testimony carefully, and then pronounce your judgment to the best of your ability and integrity. You are to determine whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty, and her fate rests in your hands. Now, Mr. Flint, you may proceed with your opening statement.
Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, on the night of January 16th, somewhere near midnight, when the lights of Broadway were blazing in electric dawn on the festive crowds below, the body of a man came hurtling through space and crashed, a disfigured mess at the foot of the Faulkner building. That body had been Sweden's great financier, Bjorn Faulkner. He fell 50 stories from his luxurious penthouse. A suicide, we're told. A great man, unwilling to face his imminent ruin. A man who found the fall from the roof of a skyscraper easier and shorter and his descent from the tottering throne as the world's financial dictator. Up to a few months ago, behind every big transaction of gold in the world stood a familiar figure. Young, tall, with an arrogant smile, with kingdoms and nations in the palm of one hand and a whip in the other. If gold is the lifeblood of the world, then Bjorn Faulkner, holding all its dark, hidden arteries, regulating its ebb and flow, its every pulsation, was the heart of that world. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the world just had a heart attack. And like all heart attacks, it was rather sudden. No one suspected the gigantic swindle that lay at the base of the Faulkner enterprise. A few days after his death, the world shook with the crash of his business. Thousands of investors were stricken with the paralysis that follows such an attack when that monstrous heart died. Bjorn Faulkner had a difficult struggle in facing the world. He had an even more difficult struggle to face within his own heart. And it is that struggle this trial will have to uncover. Two women ruled his life and his death. One of them you see before you, Karen Andre, his efficient secretary and notorious mistress. But 6 months ago, Faulkner came to America to get a loan to save his business. But fate sent him the means by which he could save his own heart. In the person of that young, lovely girl who is now his widow, Nancy Lee Faulkner, only daughter of John Graham Whitfield, our great financier. Faulkner thought that he had found salvation and a new way of life in the presence, the virtuous innocence of his new bride. And no greater proof of that is that 2 weeks after his wedding, he dismissed Karen Andre. He was through with her. But, ladies and gentlemen, one is not easily through with a woman such as Karen Andre. We can only guess at what revenge and hatred smoldered in her heart, but they leaped into flames on the night of January the 16th. Bjorn Faulkner did not kill himself. He was murdered. Murdered by the same delicate and capable hands you see before you. The hands that helped to raise him high above the world. The same hands that threw him down from a height as great to a pavement as cold as that woman's heart. That is what we shall seek to prove. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Call your first witness, Mr. Flint.
Dr. Kirkland.
Dr. Kirkland? You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Would you kindly state your name
Teresa Kirkland,
and your occupation?
medical examiner of this county.
In the course of your duties, were you called upon on the night of January 16th to investigate the death of Bjorn Faulkner?
Yes, I was called to examine the body.
And what did you find?
A body mangled to an extreme degree.
What were you able to establish as the cause of death?
A fall from a great height.
How long had Mr. Faulkner been dead when you examined his body?
I arrived half an hour after the fall.
Judging from the condition of the body, were you able to tell exactly how long he had been dead?
No. Owing to the cold weather, the blood had coagulated immediately, which makes a difference of several hours impossible to detect.
Therefore, it is possible that Faulkner was dead longer than a half an hour.
It is possible.
Is it possible that his death may have been caused by anything other than that fall?
I found no evidence of it.
For instance, if his skull had been broken before the fall, would you be able to determine that by examining his body?
No. Owing to the condition of the body, it would be impossible to determine.
Thank you very much, Doctor. No more questions.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Did you find any trace of any such earlier wound in your examination of the body, Dr. Kirkland?
No, I did not.
Did you find any indication that death might have been caused by anything other than the fall?
No, I did not.
That is all. Thank you, Dr. Kirkland.
You may step down, Dr. Turner.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Doctor.
Mr. Flint?
John Hutchins, please.
John Hutchins? You solemnly solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
What is your name?
John Joseph Hutchins, sir.
And your occupation?
I'm the night watchman at the Faulkner building.
Does Mr. Faulkner have business offices in that building?
Why, yes, sir.
Did you happen to know who owned the penthouse at the roof of the building?
Certainly, sir. Mr. Faulkner did.
And who lived there?
Mr. Faulkner and Miss Andre. But that was before Mr. Faulkner's marriage.
And after the marriage?
Oh, after the marriage, Miss Andre lived there alone.
Did you ever see Mr. Faulkner calling on Miss Andre after his marriage?
Only once, sir.
And when was that?
On the night of January 16th.
Please, tell us about it.
Well, it was about 10:30.
How did you know exactly what time it was?
Oh, well, I go on duty at 10 o'clock, and it wasn't more than a half an hour later when I heard the front entrance doorbell ring. So I went downstairs, and there was Miss Andre, and Mr. Faulkner was with her. Now, I was surprised because Miss Andre has a key and usually lets herself in.
Was there anyone with them?
Yes, sir, there were two other gentlemen.
And who were they?
I don't know.
Never saw them before?
No.
What they look like?
Well, they were both kind of slender. One of them had real sharp cheekbones, as I remember. And the other one, well, I really couldn't tell because he had his hat crooked down over his eyes. I think he had a bit too much. Meaning no disrespect.
Exactly what do you mean?
I'm afraid he was a little tight, sir. If I have the permission to say such a thing. But he wasn't very steady on his feet. Mr. Faulkner and the other gentleman practically had to drag him into the elevator.
Did Mr. Faulkner look worried?
No, sir. On the contrary, he seemed very happy.
Did he look like a man contemplating suicide?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained, Mr. Flynn.
And then what happened?
Well,
Did you see any of those guests leave them?
oh, yes, sir. About 15 minutes later, the first one came down in the elevator.
And which one was that?
That was the drunken one, sir.
Did you see?
Oh, only he didn't seem so drunk no more. He could stagger. I mean, he was staggering a little bit, but he could walk.
Did you see where he went?
Yes, sir. I wanted to help him out, seeing the condition that he was in. But he seen me coming, and he went right out the front door, got into a car that was parked right at the entrance, and boy, did he step on it. But I don't think he got far. I'm sure the cops got him.
Well, what makes you think that?
Oh, well, I noticed the car starting up right after his did.
What car?
It was a big black sedan. It was parked about 2 cars away.
Who was in it?
I only saw one man.
What makes you think that it was after the first car?
Oh, well, I couldn't say that for a fact. It just seemed funny, the both of them starting up like that.
Did you see the other stranger leave?
Yes, sir. He left about maybe 10 minutes later. There was nothing unusual. He just saw me coming and went right out. He seemed to be in some kind of a hurry.
And then what did you do?
Oh, then it was time for me to start my round. So that was about 11 o'clock, and then maybe an hour after I started, I heard this scream from the street. So I ran down to the lobby, and there's Miss Andre coming out of the elevator. Her dress is all torn, and she's screaming all wild-like.
What did Miss Andre do?
Oh, well, we went outside, we pushed through the crowds, and then she seen the body, and it was all over the pavement. Miss Andre screamed and dropped to her knees. It was horrible. I never seen nothing like that before.
Thank you. No more questions.
Good morning, Mr. Hutchins.
Good morning.
You said that you had never seen Mr. Faulkner calling on Miss Andre after his marriage, with the exception of that night. Now tell me, do you always see every visitor who comes into the building at night?
Oh, no, ma'am. I don't spend all my time in the lobby. I got to make my rounds. If a guest has a key, he could let himself in, and I'd never see him at all.
In other words, Miss Andre might have had any number of visitors, Mr. Faulkner included, whom you never saw come in.
Yes, ma'am. That's quite right.
That is all. Thank you, Mr. Hutchins.
You may step down, Mr. Hutchins.
Thank you, Mr. Hutchins.
Mr. Flynn?
Homer Van Fleet.
Homer Van Fleet. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Name?
Homer Herbert Van Fleet,
Occupation?
private investigator,
What was your last assignment?
shadowing Mr. Bjorn Faulkner
And by whom were you paid to do this?
by Mrs. Bjorn Faulkner.
Were you shadowing Mr. Faulkner on the night of January the 16th?
I was.
Kindly tell us about it.
I'll start with 6:13 p.m.
How did you know exactly what time?
Part of my duties had to record and report to Mrs. Faulkner.
I see.
6:13 p.m. Mr. Faulkner leaves his home on Long Island, wears a formal dress suit, Drives his car himself, alone. Special notation, unusual speeds all the way to New York.
Where did Faulkner go?
He went to the Faulkner building, he got out of his car and went in. It's now 7:57 p.m., all offices closed. I stay in my car and wait. 9:35 p.m. he comes out with Miss Andre. Miss Andre is also wearing formal dress. Special notation, Miss Andre is wearing a corsage of orchids of unusual proportions.
And where did they go?
Nobody's perfect in this world.
What do you mean?
I mean, I lost track of them. Due to Mr. Faulkner's speed into an accident.
What accident?
My left fender crashing into a truck. Damages to which fender charged to Mrs. Faulkner.
Well, what did you do after you lost track of them?
I went back to the Faulkner building and waited.
And when did they return?
10:30 p.m. exactly, a gray car follows them. Mr. Faulkner gets out to help Miss Andre. While she rings the bell, he goes back to the gray car, opens the door, and a thin gentleman in evening clothes steps out. Together they help out a third gentleman, the latter wearing a dark gray sport coat. Special notation, the aforementioned gentleman shows signs of inebriation. They all go into the Faulkner building.
And then what did you do?
I went to Gary's Grill across the street from the Faulkner building. I should explain I allow myself time to take nourishment every 4 hours while on duty, and it's been 4 hours since we left Long Island. I sat at a table by the window and watched the front entrance of the building.
And what did you observe?
Nothing for 15 minutes. Then the man in the gray coat came out and got in the car, the gray car, obviously in a hurry, and drove away south.
Did you see the other guest of Miss Andre leave?
Yeah, about 10 minutes later, he got out and went to a car that was parked at the curb. I don't know how it got there, but there it was. He seemed to have the keys for it and drove away.
Had you ever seen these two men in Mr. Faulkner's presence?
First time I ever saw him.
And then what did you do?
I waited. Mr. Faulkner was now alone up in the penthouse with Miss Andre. I was curious, professionally. Decided to do some investigating. I had an observation post. I'd used it before.
I mean, where was that?
The Skytop nightclub, roof of the Brooks building, 3 doors from Faulkner's. They've got an open gallery off the dance floor. You go out, you can see the Faulkner penthouse clear as the palm of your hand. I went out, I looked, I yelled.
What did you see?
No lights. Karen Andre's white gown shimmering in the moonlight. She's pushing a man's body up onto the parapet. A man in evening clothes. Faulkner. He's unconscious, no resistance. She pushes the body with all her strength. It goes over the parapet, down into space.
And then what did you do?
I ran back in the dining room, yelled what I'd seen, and a crowd followed me back to Faulkner, where we found the mess on the sidewalk and Karen Andre sobbing over it. Fit to move a first-night audience.
Did you speak with Miss Andre?
Police arrived by that time. I told them what I'd seen, like I'm telling you now.
Thank you. You're a witness?
Good morning, Mr. Van Fleet.
Morning.
Can you kindly tell us, Mr. Van Fleet, when did you start in the employ of Mrs. Faulkner?
October the 13th last.
Can you tell us the date of Mr. and Mrs. Faulkner's wedding?
October the 12th, the day before.
Exactly, just the day before. In other words, Mrs. Faulkner hired you to spy on her husband the day after their wedding?
So it seems.
What were Mrs. Faulkner's instructions when you were hired?
I was to watch Mr. Faulkner's every move and report in detail.
Any special attention to Miss Andre?
Not specified.
Had Mr. Faulkner been calling on Miss Andre after his marriage?
Yes, frequently.
In the daytime?
Seldom.
Did you report that to Mrs. Faulkner?
I did.
What was her reaction to these reports?
Mrs. Faulkner is a lady, and as such, she has no reactions.
Did she seem worried?
I don't believe so. Mr. Faulkner was the most devoted of husbands, and he loved his wife dearly.
Just how do you know that?
Those were Mrs. Faulkner's own words.
Now, Mr. Van Fleet, can you tell us kindly exactly what time you started for the Skytop nightclub on the evening of January the 16th?
11:32 exactly.
How long a walk is it from the Faulkner building to the Skytop?
3 minutes.
What time did you get out to the balcony at the Skytop?
11:57.
So it took you exactly 25 minutes. What were you doing the rest of the time?
Of course, the Skytop has a dance floor, among other things.
Did you take advantage of the other things?
I just had a couple of drinks, if I catch the drift of your curiosity, but that doesn't mean you can say I was intoxicated.
I have said nothing of the kind, as yet. Now then, you saw Miss Andre pushing Mr. Faulkner off the roof. It was a little distance away in the darkness, and you were, Well, shall we say you just had a couple of drinks?
The drinks had nothing to do with
Are
it.
you quite certain she was pushing him? Isn't it possible she was struggling with him?
Well, it's a mighty funny way of struggling. If I was struggling with a man, I wouldn't be hoisting him up by his... I wouldn't be hoisting him up, I mean.
Mr. Van Fleet, what were Mrs. Faulkner's instructions to you before you came here to testify?
I received no instructions of any kind, and I may as well tell you Mrs. Faulkner is not here to instruct me were she inclined to do so. She's been taken to California by her father to rest her shattered nerves.
Mr. Van Fleet, do you think that Mr. Faulkner's suicide is very flattering to Mrs. Faulkner?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Mr. Van Fleet, can you tell us how much a witness to Mr. Faulkner's murder would be worth to Mrs. Faulkner?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained, Miss Stevens.
I should like to remind Miss Stevens she may be sued for making insinuations of that kind.
I made no insinuation, Mr. Van Fleet. I merely asked a question in a general way.
Well, I would like to tell you in a general way that perjury is not part of a private investigator's duties.
No special notations to that rule?
None.
That is all. Thank you, Mr. Van
Not
Fleet.
quite. Ask him 2 more questions.
Certainly. What are they, Miss Andre? What kind of a car do you drive, Mr. Van Fleet?
A brown Buick 2-door sedan, last year's model. Old but serviceable.
Did you see anybody following the car in a gray car when the man in the gray car drove away?
I don't believe I did. Traffic was pretty heavy at the time.
That is all. Thank you, Mr. Van Fleet.
You may step down, Mr. Van Fleet.
Thank you, Mr. Van Fleet.
Mr. Flint, your next witness.
Magda Stenson. Excuse me. Detective Sweeney.
Detective Sweeney. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. What is your name
Michael Sweeney,
and your occupation?
homicide detective.
On that January 16th, were you called upon to investigate the death of Bjorn Faulkner?
Yes, sir, I was one of the first officers called to the scene.
Did you question Miss Andre?
Not right away. Before I could, that private investigator Van Fleet rushed up to me and yelled that he saw Karen Andre throw Faulkner off the roof.
Well, how did Miss Andre react to that?
She was stunned. She just stood there. Her eyes wide fit to burst, and it crossed my heart. She started to laugh. I thought she went crazy.
Well, what did you do?
I ordered her held for questioning and took her up with us in the elevator to examine the penthouse.
Did you find anything unusual in the penthouse?
Unusual? Yes, in the bedroom.
What did you find in the bedroom?
Nightgowns. Lace nightgowns. Just about made out of thin air. A crystal bathtub in the bathroom. And when we turned the shower on, the water was perfumed.
I think you must have misunderstood my question, Detective. I wasn't referring to the aesthetic values of the penthouse. I was asking if you found anything unusual that might be connected with Bjorn Faulkner's death.
Yes, sir, in the living room.
And what did you find in the living room?
A letter lying in plain view on a table, sealed and addressed to whomsoever finds it first.
Is this the letter?
Yes, sir.
Would you kindly read it to the jury?
If any future historian wants to record what my last advice to humanity, I'll say that I found only 2 enjoyable things on this earth, whose ever door was open to me. My whip over the world and Karen Andre. To those who can use it, the advice is worth what it costs mankind. Bjorn Faulkner.
And
Entered as prosecution exhibit A.
now, Detective, did you question Miss Andre about this letter?
I did. She said Faulkner wrote the letter, placed it on the table, and ordered her not to touch it. Then went up to the roof garden. She struggled with him when she saw what he was going to do, but she couldn't stop him.
Did you ask her who was with them that night?
I did. She said 2 gentlemen had. They were friends of Faulkner, and she had never seen them before. He had picked them up at a nightclub that evening and brought them along. She said their names were Jerry White and Dick Saunders.
Did you try to locate 2 gentlemen by these names among Mr. Faulkner's acquaintances?
We did. We found that no one ever heard of them.
And Miss Andre told you, as she told the inquest, that she had never seen them before.
Yes, sir.
Was she very emphatic about that?
Yes, very.
Thank you. No more questions.
Good morning, Detective.
Morning.
Miss Andre told you that she had struggled with Mr. Faulkner to prevent his suicide. Now, tell me, did you notice any evidence of a struggle in her clothes?
Yes, ma'am. Her dress was torn, and it had 2 diamond shoulder straps, and one was broken, so she had to hold up the dress with one hand.
What did you think of that?
I have to answer that?
You certainly do.
I wish she had broken the other strap, too.
Detective Sweeney, I meant the The dress looked as though it had been torn in a struggle.
Looked like it. Yes.
Now, can you tell us why on earth you turned the shower on in the bathroom?
We had heard that Faulkner had wine instead of water in it.
You mustn't believe all the legends you hear about Bjorn Faulkner. That is all, Detective.
You may stand down.
Thank you.
Thank you, Detective Sweeney.
Mr. Flint, your next witness.
Magda Svensson.
Magda Svensson. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I swear.
What is your name?
You know it. You just called me.
Kindly answer my questions without arguing. Kindly state your name.
Magda Svensson.
And what is your occupation?
I am housekeeper.
By whom were you last employed?
By Herr Bjorn Faulkner, and before that his father.
How long have you been employed by these people?
I've been in the family 38 years. I remember Herr Bjorn since he was a little child.
When did you come to America?
I've been here 5 years.
And what were the duties that Mr. Faulkner assigned you?
I keep penthouse for him. He visits here every year or so. I stay even after he go when he gets married, but I never employed by this one.
Now, Miss Svensson, can you...
Miss Svensson, yes.
I beg your pardon. Miss Svensson. Can you tell us anything about the relationship between Karen Andre and Mr. Faulkner?
Oh, decent woman like me should not know about such things, but sin is shameless in this world.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained. Miss Svensson, kindly stick to the facts, please.
Kindly tell us about it.
From very first day this woman appeared, she was sleeping with Herr Faulkner. It's not a good thing when man forget lying between his bed and his desk, and she put her claws tight on both. Sometimes they discuss loans and dividends in bed. Other times the door to his office was locked, and under the window shades, which was pulled down, I seen her lace pants on the windowsill.
Objection, Your Honor.
I think Miss Andre should have objected years ago.
Such line of testimony
These
is
are
outrageous.
facts pertaining to the
Hey,
relationship
I'm
as
Counselors, I shall ask the witness to word her testimony a little more carefully.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Sin is sin, no matter what you call it, Your Honor.
Didn't I make myself clear, Miss Svensson?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us, Miss Svensson, of an incident in which Miss Andre's conduct was detrimental to Mr. Faulkner in ways other than moral?
I do so. You try count up all money he wasted on that woman.
Can you give us an example of his extravagance?
I tell you, he had a platinum dress made for her. Yeah, I said platinum. Fine mesh, fine and soft as silk. She wore it on her naked body. He would build a fire in the fireplace, unheat the dress, and put it on her. And when it cooled, you could see her body in silver sheen, and it had been more decent if she had been naked. And she has to put it on as hot as she can stand, and if it burned her shameless skin, she laughed like the pagan she is. And he kissed her burn wild like tiger.
Your Honor, I have to object here. This is completely irrelevant. It only tends to prejudice the jury against Miss Andre.
Let her talk, Stevens. Perhaps it may prejudice the jury in my favor.
Oh, Miss Stevens has my sympathy. Her client isn't an easy one to
Your Honor,
handle.
kindly instruct Mr. Flint to refrain from personal prejudice.
Silence! Overruled.
Miss Svensson,
Continue, Mr.
were you able to observe Mr. Faulkner's attitude towards his marriage?
Oh, he happy for first time in his life like decent man but found right road.
Did you know of anything in those days that made him worry enough that it could eventually lead to a suicide?
No, nothing.
Could you tell us what Miss Andre's attitude was towards Mr. Faulkner's marriage?
Well, she's silent, like stone statue. She not say word.
Can I have a moment, Your Honor?
Make it brief, Mr. Flint.
Mrs. Faulkner?
I understand you wanted to call me as a witness.
Well, I did, but I understood you were in California.
I was. I escaped.
Escaped?
Yes. Father was concerned over my health. Well, he wouldn't allow me to come back. But I need to do the duty toward the memory of my husband. I'm at your disposal, Mr. Flint.
I can only express my gratitude, but sit down and be with you in a moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor.
Proceed, Mr. Flint.
Now, Miss Svensson, you were telling us about Miss Andre's attitude towards Mr. Faulkner's marriage.
Well, I say she keeps silent, but I hear her crying one night after the wedding, crying and sobbing, and this for the first and only time in her life.
Did she seem to suffer much?
Suffer? Oh, no, not her. One man more or less make no much difference to her. I seen her unfaithful to Herr Faulkner the night of his wedding.
Objection, Your Honor.
Objection overruled, Mr. Stevens.
Unfaithful with whom?
Oh, I not know the man. I seen him for the first time the night of Herr Faulkner's wedding.
Please, tell us about it.
Oh, well, I gone to wedding. Oh, it was beautiful. My poor Herr Bjorn, so handsome, and a lovely bride, all white and lovely like Lily. I cried like looking at my own children. But she not go to wedding.
Did Miss Andre stay at home?
Oh, she stay at home. I come back early. She not hear me come. She was home, but she was not alone.
And then what happened?
Well, she was out in the garden with him on the roof, and it was dark, but I could see. He was holding her in his arms, and I think he wanted to crush her bones. He bent her back so far, I think she fall into her reflection in the pool. And then he kissed her, and I think he never get his lips off hers.
And then?
Oh, well, she step aside and say something. I not hear. She speak very soft. He not say a word. He just take her hand and kiss it and hold it against his lips so long I get tired of waiting and go back to my room.
Objection, Your Honor. Whomever Karen Andre chooses to have an affair with in this particular case is completely irrelevant. I ask that those remarks be stricken.
Sustained.
Thank
Get to
you.
the point, Mr. Flint.
Did you ever learn the identity of this man?
No.
Did you ever see him again?
Yeah, once.
And that was when?
The night of January 16th.
Kindly tell us about it.
Well, she very strange that day. She called me and said I have rest of day off, and I been suspicious.
Well, why did that make you suspicious?
Well, my day off is Thursday, and I not ask for second day. So I say I not need rest of day. She says she not need me, so I go.
And what time was it when you left?
About 4 o'clock, but I want to know secret, so I come back.
Or what time was it when you came back?
About 10 at night. House dark. She not home, so I wait. Half hour after I hear them coming. But I seen Herr Faulkner was with her, so I afraid to stay. But before I go, I seen there was 2 gentlemen with them. One gentleman, he was drunk. I not know him.
Did you know the other gentleman?
The other one, he was dark and slender and had sharp cheekbones. He was the man I seen kissing Miss Andre.
Thank you very much. No more questions.
Just a minute, Miss Svensson. You still have to talk with me a little.
Oh, for what? I say all I know.
You may know the answers to a few more questions. Now then, you said that you had seen that stranger kissing Miss Andre?
Yeah, I did.
And it was dark that night when you saw him for the first time?
Yeah, it was dark.
And on the evening of January the 16th, when you were so ingeniously spying on your mistress, you said that you saw her come in with Mr. Faulkner and you hurried to depart in order not to be caught. Am I correct?
You have a good memory.
You just had a swift glance at the 2 gentlemen with them?
Yeah.
Can you tell us what the drunken gentleman looked like?
How can I? No time to notice face and too dark at door.
So, it was too dark, and you were in a hurry, yet you were able to identify a man you had seen but once before?
Let me tell you, missus, I am under oath, as you say, and I am religious woman, and I do respect oath. I said it was the same man, and I say it again.
That is all. Thank you, Miss Benson.
You may step down, Miss Benson.
Thank you, Mrs. Benson.
Mr. Flint?
Nancy Lee Faulkner.
Nancy Lee Faulkner. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Your Honor, I'd like a sidebar, please.
Counselor's approach.
Your Honor, please, I would like to request a 10-minute recess at this time.
What for? I'll ask.
I am not prepared for Mrs. Faulkner's testimony, Your Honor. I was told that
What was that?
Mr. Flint.
I was told that she was to be in California.
Well, she was, but she came
Mr.
back.
Flint.
I am not prepared for the testimony.
She's in the same slot she was scheduled to be
Mr.
in.
Flint!
I'll handle this. She is definitely on the witness list. And in order, you didn't do your homework, Not gonna stop my court. Overruled.
What is your name?
Nancy Lee Faulkner.
What was your relation to the late Bjorn Faulkner?
I was his wife.
I realize how painful this is, and I appreciate your courage. But I'm going to have to ask many questions that will awaken sad memories.
I am ready, Mr. Flint.
When did you first meet Bjorn Faulkner?
In August of last year,
And where was that?
at a ball given by my friend Sandra Van Rensselaer in Newport.
Please tell us about it, Mrs. Faulkner.
Sandra introduced us. Well, I remember she said, "Here's a tough one for you, Nancy. I wonder whether you'll add this scalp to the well-known collection." Sandra had always insisted on exaggerating my popularity. I danced with him that night. We danced in the garden, under the trees. And we stopped by the edge of the pool. We were alone in the darkness, with the faint sound of the blue Danube waltz filling the silence. I remember Mr. Faulkner reached up to pick a rose for me, and as he tore it off, his hand brushed my bare shoulder. I don't know why, but I blushed. He noticed it and apologized, graciously smiling. Then he took me back to the guests. I think we both felt a silent understanding that night, but we did not dance again with each other.
When did you see Mr. Faulkner again?
3 days later, I invited him to dine at my home on Long Island. A real Swedish meal. I cooked it myself.
Did you see him often after that?
Oh, yes. Quite often. Well, his visits became more and more frequent until the day
Until the day?
he proposed to me.
Kindly tell us about it, Mrs. Faulkner.
We went driving, Mr. Faulkner and I alone. Oh, it was a beautiful day with a bright, cold sunshine. I remember I was driving my car, and I felt so young, so happy, that I grew. I'm sorry. It is just a little hard for me to remember those times. I grew reckless, and I was reckless enough to lose my way. And we stopped on a strange country road. I laughed and said, "We're lost. I kidnapped you and I won't release you." And he said, "The ransom you want is not in circulation." Then suddenly, he seized my hand and staring straight at me, he said, "What's the use of pretending? I love you."
I'm so sorry, Mrs. Faulkner. I'm sure if you want to be dismissed and come back tomorrow...
No. Thank you. I'm all right. I can go on. It was then that I first learned about the desperate state of Mr. Faulkner's fortune. He said he had to tell me the truth, that he could not ask me to marry him when he had nothing to offer me. But I loved him, and I told him that money had never meant anything to me.
Did Mr. Faulkner seem hopeless about the future when your engagement was announced?
No. Oh, not at all. Well, he said that my faith in him and my courage helped him so much. I told him that it was our duty to save his enterprises, our duty to the world that he had wronged, not to ourselves. I made him realize his past mistakes, and he was ready to atone for them. We were entering a new life together, a life of unselfish devotion towards the service and welfare of others.
Did you stay in New York after your marriage?
Yes, we made our home on my Long Island residence. Mr. Faulkner gave up the New York penthouse.
Now, Mrs. Faulkner, did Mr. Faulkner tell you of his relations with Miss Andre?
No, not then. But he did 2 weeks after our wedding. He came to me and he said, "Dearest, there is a woman. There was a woman, and I feel I must tell you about her." And I said, "I know it, and you don't have to say a word if you'd rather not, dear."
What did he say?
He said, "Karen Andre is the symbol and cause of my darkest years, and I'm going to dismiss her."
And what did you answer?
I told him that he was right, that I understood him. But I said, "We must not be cruel. Perhaps you can find another position for Miss Andre." And
And he said that he'd provide for her financially, but that he never wanted to see her again.
Therefore, Mr. Faulkner dismissed Miss Andre voluntarily of his own will?
Mr. Flint, there are two kinds of women in this world, and my kind is never jealous of the other.
Miss Faulkner, can you tell us what Mr. Faulkner's business situation was at the time of the marriage?
I'm afraid I don't know much about business. I know that Father made a loan, a very large loan to my husband.
Now, can you tell us, Mrs. Faulkner, whether you believe it possible that your husband had any reason to commit suicide?
I think it totally impossible.
Did he speak about his plans for the future?
We both used to dream of the future together. Well, even on the evening before his death, we were sitting by the fire in his study, talking about our years ahead. We knew that we'd not be wealthy for a long time, if ever. But that did not matter to us, because we had renounced material concerns with all their consequences. Pride, selfishness, ambition, the desire to rise above fellow man. We wanted to devote our lives to spiritual values. Well, we were planning on leaving the city, to become part of some modest community, to be like everybody else.
And that was on the night of January 15th, the day before his death?
Yes.
Can you tell us what he did during the day of January 16th?
He spent it in town, on business as usual. He came home late in the afternoon and said he had a business banquet to attend in New York that night. So he did not eat dinner at home. He left about 6 o'clock.
Do you know what banquet he was supposed to attend?
No, I didn't ask, and he didn't tell me. I made it a point never to interfere in my husband's business.
Mrs. Faulkner, did you notice anything peculiar about Mr. Faulkner when he left that night?
No, not a thing. He kissed me goodbye and said that he'd try to come home early. I stood in the door and watched him drive away. He waved goodbye as his car disappeared into the dusk. I remember I stood there a few moments thinking of how happy we were, of how beautiful our love had been, like a delicate idol. I just didn't realize that our beautiful romance would indirectly, through jealousy, bring about his death.
Objection, Your Honor. Move that that be stricken.
Sustained. So ordered.
No more questions, Mrs. Faulkner.
Will you be able to answer a few questions now, Mrs. Faulkner?
As many as you wish, Miss Stevens.
You said that your relationship was like a perfect dream, didn't you?
Yes.
A sacred troth that regenerated a soul.
Yes.
A beautiful, uplifting relationship based on mutual trust.
Yes.
Then why did you hire a detective to spy on your husband?
I didn't hire a detective to spy on my husband. I hired him to protect Mr. Faulkner.
Will you kindly explain that?
Well, yes. Some time ago, Mr. Faulkner was threatened by a gangster, Tony Regan, I believe that was his name. Mr. Faulkner paid no attention to it. Nobody could intimidate him. But I was worried. So as soon as we were married, I hired Mr. Van Fleet to watch my husband. And I did it secretly because I knew Mr. Faulkner would object.
How could a sleuth following at a distance protect Mr. Faulkner?
Well, I thought the underworld had a way of finding those things out. I didn't think they would attack a man that was constantly watched.
So all Mr. Van Fleet had to do was watch Mr. Faulkner?
Yes.
Mr. Faulkner alone?
Yes.
Not Mr. Faulkner and Miss Andre?
Miss Stevens, that supposition is insulting to
I
me.
haven't noticed you sparing insults, Mrs.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained, Miss Stevens.
I am sorry, Miss Stevens. I assure you that was not my intention.
Now, Mr. Faulkner said that he never wanted to see Miss Andre again. Is that correct?
Yes.
And yet he called on her after his marriage. He called on her often and at night. The detective told you that, didn't he?
Yes, I knew it.
How do you explain it?
I cannot explain it. How can I know what blackmail she was holding over his
How
head?
do you explain the fact that Mr. Faulkner lied to you
Objection, Your Honor.
on the evening of January the 16th and went straight to Miss Andre's house?
If I could explain that, Miss Stevens, perhaps I could save you the bother of this trial. Well, we would have an explanation for my husband's mysterious death. All I know is that she made him come to her house for some reason which he could not tell me, and that he was found dead that night.
Mrs. Faulkner, I want you to answer just one more question.
Yes,
I want you to state here under oath that Bjorn Faulkner loved you.
Bjorn Faulkner was mine.
That is all, Mrs. Faulkner.
No, that's not all. Ask her one more question, Stevens.
Certainly. What is it, Miss Andre?
Ask her whether she loved him.
I did, Miss Andre.
And how can you sit there and speak of him as you did? How can you sit there and lie?
Objection, Your Honor.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Are you all right, Mrs. Faulkner?
Yes,
You may step down.
thank you.
Mrs. Faulkner, one of us is lying, and we both know which one.
I'm so sorry, Mrs. Faulkner.
Will the clerk please remove the jury? This court is adjourned until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Your Honor. Court attention. Superior Court number 11 of the State of New York, the Honorable Judge William Heath presiding.
Morning, Christina.
Morning, Your Honor.
Morning, Your Honor.
People of the state of New York versus Karen Andre.
Ready, Your Honor?
Ready, Your Honor.
Mr. Flint?
Your Honor, please, the prosecution has one final witness to introduce, Mr. John Graham Whitfield.
John Graham Whitfield. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
What is your name
John Graham Whitfield.
and your occupation?
I'm president of the Whitfield National Bank.
Were you related to the late Bjorn Faulkner?
I was his father-in-law.
It is quite obvious, Mr. Whitfield, that you are well qualified to pass judgment on financial affairs. Could you tell us the state of Mr. Faulkner's business at the time of his marriage?
I shall say it was desperate, but not hopeless. My bank made a loan of $25 million to Mr. Faulkner in an effort to save his enterprises. Needless to say, that money is lost.
Well, what prompted you to make that loan, Mr. Whitfield?
He was the husband of my only daughter. Her happiness has always been paramount to me. But my motives were not entirely personal. Realizing the countless tragedies of small investors that the crash would bring, I considered it my duty to make every possible effort to prevent it.
Is it possible that you would have risked such a considerable sum in Mr. Faulkner's enterprises if you believed them hopelessly destined to crash?
Certainly not. It was a difficult undertaking, but I had full confidence that my business acumen would have prevented the crash.
Therefore, Mr. Faulkner...
Had Faulkner lived.
Therefore, Mr. Faulkner had no reason to commit suicide as far as his business was concerned.
He had every reason for remaining alive.
Now, Mr. Whitfield, can you tell us, was he happy in his family life, in his relations with your daughter?
Mr. Flint, I would like to state that I have always regarded the home and the family as the most important institutions of our lives. You will therefore believe me when I tell you how important my daughter's family happiness was to me, and she had found perfect happiness with Mr. Faulkner.
Mr. Whitfield, what was your opinion of Bjorn Faulkner?
It's only fair to admit that he had many qualities of which I did not approve. We were as different as two human beings could be. I believe in one's duty above all. Bjorn Faulkner believed in nothing but his own pleasure.
Well then, knowing him as you did, would you say that you consider it possible that Mr. Faulkner committed suicide?
I consider it absolutely impossible.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. No more questions?
Good morning, Mr. Whitfield.
Good morning.
Mr. Whitfield, were you very fond of your son-in-law?
Yes.
And you never disagreed with him, never lost your temper in a quarrel?
Miss Stevens, I never lose my temper.
If my memory serves me right, wasn't there some kind of trouble at the time you made that stupendous loan to Mr. Faulkner? Wasn't there something said to the effect that you denied making the loan?
Purely a misunderstanding, I assure you. I must admit that Mr. Faulkner made a somewhat unethical attempt at hastening that loan, which was quite unnecessary since I granted it gladly for my daughter's sake.
You said that your fortune has been badly damaged by the Faulkner crash.
Yes.
And that your financial situation is rather strained at present?
Yes.
Then how could you afford to offer a $100,000 reward for the arrest and conviction of Tony Regan?
Objection, Your Honor. What has this to do with this?
Your Honor, I would like to have the opportunity of explaining this.
Very well, I'll allow it.
I did offer such a reward. I was prompted by a feeling of civic duty. The gentleman known as Tony Regan is a notorious criminal. I offered such a reward for evidence that would make his arrest and conviction possible. However, I agree with Mr. Flint that this has nothing to do with the present case.
Mr. Whitfield, can you tell us why did you leave for California in such a hurry before the beginning of this trial?
I think the answer is obvious. My daughter was crushed by the sudden tragedy. I hastened to take her away to save her health, perhaps her life.
You love your daughter profoundly.
Yes.
You always make it a point that her every wish should be granted, don't you?
I can proudly say yes.
When she or you desire anything, you don't stop at the price.
We don't have to.
Then would you refuse to buy her the man she wanted?
Objection, Your Honor.
Miss Stevens.
You wouldn't stop if it took your entire fortune to break the first unbreakable man you ever met?
We object to this line of questioning,
Mr.
Your
Whitfield,
Honor.
do you mean to tell me that
Sustained,
money had
Miss
absolutely nothing to do with Mr. Faulkner dismissing Miss Andre, that no ultimatum was delivered to him?
You're quite mistaken in your insinuations. My daughter was no more jealous of Miss Andre than she would be of Mr. Faulkner's soiled underwear. All men have some at one time or another.
I'd be careful of statements such as these, Mr. Whitfield. Remember, your daughter paid for what Karen Andre got free.
Objection, Your Honor.
Why, you goddamn impudent! You know who I am? You know that I can crush you like a cockroach? I've crushed many a better
That's
attorney!
what I wanted to prove. That is all. Thank you, Mr. Whitfield.
Prosecution moves that the defense counsel's outrageous remark that led to this incident be stricken.
So ordered. You may step down, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield.
Mr. Flint?
The people rest, Your Honor.
Move that the case be dismissed for lack of evidence.
Denied.
Exception.
Noted. You
May
may
I-
proceed with your opening remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you cannot pass judgment on Karen Andre without passing it on Bjorn Faulkner. He had pushed himself beyond all present standards. Whether it was below or above them is a question for each of us to decide personally. But I will ask you to remember that Bjorn Faulkner was the man that said he needed no justifications for his actions. He was the justification. The man who said that rules were made for the fun of breaking them. If you'll remember that, then you'll know that the world he was thrown into in the last few months was as desperate to him as a tiger in a vegetarian cafeteria. And to escape it, he would be driven to the most desperate means, including suicide. My first witness will be Sigurd Youngquist. Sigurd Youngquist. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
What is your name?
Sigurd Youngquist.
What is your occupation?
My last position was secretary to Mr. Bjorn Faulkner.
How long did you hold that position?
Since last November, ever since Miss Andre left,
What position did you hold before that?
I was bookkeeper to Mr.
How
Faulkner.
long did you hold that position?
8 years.
Did Mr. Faulkner give you Miss Andre's position after she was dismissed?
Yes.
Did Miss Andre instruct you in your new duties?
Yes, she did.
What was her behavior at that time? Did she seem to be angry, sorry, or resentful?
Oh, no. No, she was very calm, just like always, and explained everything to me very clearly.
Did you notice any trouble at that time between Mr. Faulkner and Miss Andre?
Oh, no trouble.
Were you witness to any business conferences between Mr. Whitfield and Mr. Faulkner?
I'm never present at conferences, but but I've seen Mr. Whitfield come to the office a few times. Mr. Whitfield didn't like Mr. Faulkner.
Objection.
Overruled.
What makes you think that?
Well, it's what he said one day. Mr. Faulkner was desperate for money, and Mr. Whitfield asked him very sarcastically what he was going to do if the business crashed. Well, Mr. Faulkner shrugged his shoulders and said lightly, I don't know, commit suicide.
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
So then, Mr. Whitfield turned to Mr. Faulkner and said to him very coldly, well, if you do, make sure you do a good job of it.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
Sustained. Jury will disregard the witness's last remark.
If Your Honor, please, I would like to report an incident which I consider a hoax and whose purpose I would like to determine. May I approach, Your Honor? Apparently, a gentleman just phoned in on my email and said that he would like to speak with me immediately. When informed that it was absolutely impossible, he left the following message. Do not put Karen Andre on the stand until I get there. No signature.
I want to go on the stand right away.
May I ask why, Miss Andre?
Question me now, Stevens.
I'm afraid it's impossible, Miss Andre. We have to finish our examination of Mr. Youngquist. Your Honor, I just wanted to make sure that that was in the record.
See the record?
May I continue?
I'd like for you to keep your client under control. No more interruptions.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Youngquist, where were you on the night of January the 16th?
I was in the Faulkner building. I was working late. I worked late many nights.
And when you heard about Mr. Faulkner's death, what did you do?
Well, I wanted to call Mr. Whitfield. I tried his home on Long Island and talked to his butler, but he wasn't there. I tried his office in town, and he wasn't there either. I tried many places, and then I tried his home again, and then I had to tell Mrs. Faulkner that her husband had committed suicide.
And when you told Mrs. Faulkner that, what were her first words?
She said, for God's sakes, don't give it to the newspapers.
That is all. Thank you, Mr. Youngquist.
What's the hurry? Whom are you expecting? Mr. Youngquist, you were employed by Mr. Faulkner for over 8 years, weren't you?
That's right.
And all that time, did you know how crooked and criminal your boss's operations were?
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
No, I did not.
You do know now what a swindler and a criminal he was, don't you?
No, I do not know
Oh, you
that.
don't, huh? You didn't know what all those fantastic financial operations of his were?
I only know that Mr. Faulkner was allowed to do things that other people weren't allowed to do.
And how
I
did
never
you-
questioned, I never doubt. I just know that what he did wasn't wrong.
And how did you know that?
Because he was Mr. Bjorn Faulkner.
Oh, and he could do no wrong.
Mr. Flint, when little people like you or I meet a man like Bjorn Faulkner, we tip our hats and we bow and we take orders, but we don't ask questions.
Oh, splendid, Mr. Youngquist. Your devotion to your master is worthy of admiration. You'd do anything for him, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Were you equally devoted to Miss Andre?
Miss Andre was dear to Mr. Faulkner.
Then a little matter like a few lies for your master's sake would mean nothing to you, would
Objection,
they?
Your Honor.
Sustained, Mr. Flint.
I did not lie, Mr. Flint, and Mr. Faulkner could not have told me to lie. But if I had the choice, I would rather lie for Mr. Faulkner rather than tell the truth for you.
Oh, for which statement I am more grateful than you'll ever know. No more questions, Mr. Youngquist.
You may step down, Mr. Youngquist.
Miss Andre?
Karen Andre.
Your Honor, may we approach, please?
Approach. Both counsel.
Matter of procedure, Miss Stevens is going out of order. It seems, who's running this case?
I
Seems
am
that
Mr. Flint, and don't you forget.
Miss Andre wants to go on the stand. Miss Andre goes on the stand. Is not on the roster.
Mr.
Is
Flint, who do you have to testify next for the defense?
For the defense, she's supposed to follow.
She is.
But Miss Andre
Show you
is.
the list.
She's not in the right order.
Oh, yes. Step back.
Thank you, Your Honor. Miss Andre? You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
That's useful from an atheist.
The witness will affirm regardless.
I affirm.
What is your name?
Karen Andre,
What is your occupation?
Secretary to Bjorn Faulkner.
How long did you hold that position?
10 years.
Tell us about your first meeting with Faulkner.
I answered his advertisement for a stenographer. I met him for the first time in his office on an obscure side street in Stockholm. He was alone. It was my first job. It was his first office.
How did Faulkner greet you?
He got up and didn't say a word. He just stood there and stared at me. His mouth was insulting even when silent. You couldn't stand his gaze very long. I didn't know whether I wanted to kneel or slap his face. I didn't do either. I told him what I'd come for.
Did he hire you then?
He said I was too young and he didn't like me. But he threw a stenographer's pad at me and told me to get down to work, for he was in a hurry.
And you
So
worked?
I did.
You worked all day?
All day. He dictated as fast, almost faster than he could talk. He didn't give me time to say a word. He didn't smile once, and he never took his eyes off me.
When did he first touch you?
When did he first take me? That first day I met him.
How did that happen?
He seemed to take a delight in giving me orders. He acted as if he were cracking a whip of an animal he wanted to break, and I was afraid.
Because you didn't like that?
Because I liked it. After my 8 hours, I told him that I was quitting. He looked at me and didn't answer. Then he asked me suddenly if I'd ever slept with a man before. I said no, I hadn't. He said he'd give me $1,000 if I would go into the inner office and take my skirt off. I said I wouldn't. He said if I didn't, he'd take me. I said try it. He did.
Go on.
After a while, I picked up my clothes. But I didn't go. I stayed. I kept the job.
And you worked and lived and rose to success together ever since?
For 10 years. When we made our first million, he took me to Vienna. We sat in a restaurant where the orchestra played Sing Gypsy. When we made 10 million, he took me to Delhi. We stood on the shores of the Ganges on the steps of an old temple where men had been sacrificed to gods. When we made 25 million, he took me to New York. He hired a pilot to fly a plane above the city, and the wind blew Bjorn's hair like a banner over the world at his feet.
Can you tell us the extent of Mr. Faulkner's fortune at the height of his success?
No, and he couldn't tell you himself. He had no personal fortune. He took what he wanted. When he owed money to one of his companies, it was crossed off the books and debited to the accounts of several other concerns. It was very simple. We prepared all the balance sheets ourselves.
Why did a man of Mr. Faulkner's genius resort to such methods?
He wanted to build a gigantic net and build it fast. A net over the world held in his own hand. He had to draw unlimited sums of money. He had to establish his credit. So we paid dividends out of our capital. Dividends much higher than we actually earned.
When did Mr. Faulkner's business difficulties start?
Over a year ago.
What brought Mr. Faulkner to America this time?
A short-term loan of $10 million from the Whitfield National Bank was due and we could not meet it. We had to have an extension, but Whitfield refused it until his daughter came into the question.
How did that happen?
He told me about it. They met at a party and she made it obvious that she was greatly interested in him. Then he came to me one day and said, Karen, we have only one piece of collateral left and you're holding it. You're going to have to let me borrow it for a while. I said, certainly, Bjorn, what is it? He said it was himself. I asked Nancy Whitfield. He nodded. I didn't answer at once. It wasn't very easy for me to say. And then I said, all right, Bjorn. He asked if that would change things between us. I said no.
Had Mr. Faulkner proposed to Miss Whitfield?
No. She had proposed to him.
How did that happen?
He told me about it. She took him for a drive and stopped on a lonely road. She said that they were lost, that she had kidnapped him and wouldn't release him. He answered that the money she wanted was not in circulation. Then she turned to him point blank and said, what's the use of pretending? I want you and you know it. You don't want me and I know that. But I pay for what I want and I have the price.
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
He asked, what is the price? She said the extension of a certain $10 million loan you'll need in order to save your business. If you stay out of jail as a swindler, it can be only in the custody of Mrs. Bjorn.
That is a lie! That is a shameless lie! You know it!
Your Honor!
Your Honor,
Please, anyone disturbing the proceedings here will be asked to leave. Now sit down.
What was his answer to that, Miss Andre?
He said it will cost you an awful lot of money. She said money has never meant anything to me. Then he said, will you always remember that this is a business deal? You're not buying any feeling and you're not to expect any. She said, I don't need any. You'll have your money and I'll have you. Such was the bargain.
Was Mr. Whitfield eager to accept such a bargain?
Bjorn thought Whitfield would have a stroke when his daughter's decision was announced, but she insisted. She always has her way. It was agreed that the loan would be extended and that Whitfield would give Bjorn unlimited credit.
In other words, Mr. Faulkner sold himself as his last security?
Yes. And like the others, it meant nothing to him.
Did you resent that marriage?
No, I didn't. We had always faced our business as a war. We both looked at this as our hardest campaign.
Why did Mr. Faulkner dismiss you 2 weeks after his wedding?
He was forced to. Whitfield refused to advance the money that he had promised.
What reason did he offer for that refusal?
The reason that Bjorn was keeping a mistress. It was Miss Whitfield's ultimatum. I had to be dismissed.
And did he grant the loan after you were dismissed?
No, he refused it again. He attached what he called a slight condition to it.
What was that condition?
He wanted the controlling interests in Bjorn's enterprises.
Did Mr. Faulkner agree to that?
Bjorn said he'd rather gather all the stock certificates into one pile and strike a match.
And did Mr. Whitfield grant the loan?
No, he didn't grant it. Bjorn took it.
Just how do you know that?
I helped him do it. He forged $25 million worth of securities. It helped him only temporarily, however. Certain dividend payments were coming due and we could not meet them. We had stretched our credit to the utmost and, well, there was no more to be had.
How did Mr. Faulkner take the situation?
He knew it was the end.
What were his plans?
You don't find men like Bjorn Faulkner cringing before a bankruptcy commission, and you don't find them locked in jail.
And the alternative?
He was not afraid of this world. He had defied its every law. He was going to leave it when and how he pleased. If he had to take his own
Karen, you don't understand. Don't say anything else you really have to say.
Of course.
Stevens, don't ever say another word.
You are in contempt
Karen,
of
your
court.
testimony is useless. He's dead.
Are you all right? You may step down. This court will take a brief recess. Counselors, both of you in my chambers.
Thank you, Officer. Well, it seems we are not only enduring stormy weather outside, but equally stormy weather here at the District 1 courthouse, as dramatics and sudden revelations were the tone for the day of testimony in the trial of Karen Andre, accused killer of Swedish gold magnate Bjorn Faulkner. Among the intrusions was the sudden appearance of mafioso Tony Regan. A notable link to mob activity in the area, Regan came in at the end of Karen Andre's remarkable testimony of sex, money, and her life with Bjorn Faulkner. Ms. Andre's shocking testimony of rape and power struggle proved a staggering counterpoint to the testimony of Mrs. Nancy Lee Whitfield Faulkner, the widow of Bjorn Faulkner, whose appearance set the courtroom on its first of many disruptive moments. Judge Heath seems to be in control of the situation for the time being, but the possibility remains that he could very well clear the courtroom soon if any more unusual and intrusive disclosures should cause his court to become ungovernable. We will continue to bring more coverage as this twisted tale of sex, money, and murder unravels. In the meantime, this is Leslie McCormick reporting from District 1 Courthouse. Back to you, Roger.
Court attention. Superior Court number 11 of the State of New York. The Honorable Judge William Heath presiding.
Morning.
Morning, Your Honor.
People of the state of New York versus Karen Andre.
Ready, Your
Ready,
Honor.
Your Honor. The prosecution would like to report that I've issued a warrant for the arrest of Tony Regan. He is obviously an accomplice in this murder, but he's disappeared. He was last seen with the defense counsel, and I
Keep
think...
your shirt on. Who's disappeared? What do you suppose I appeared for? Just to give you some sort of thrill? You don't have to issue any warrants, Your Honor. I'll stay here. And if she's guilty, then I'm guilty.
Miss Stevens?
I would like to recall Karen Andre to the stand.
Well, Karen Andre. Miss Andre, I must remind you, you are still under oath.
Miss Andre, when you first took the stand, did you know the whole truth about this case?
No.
Do you wish to retract any of your testimony?
No.
When you first took the stand, did you intend to shield anyone?
Yes.
Whom?
Bjorn Faulkner.
Do you still find it necessary to shield him?
It's not necessary anymore.
Do you still claim that Bjorn Faulkner committed suicide?
No. Bjorn Faulkner did not commit suicide. He was murdered, and I did not kill him, please believe me. Not for my sake, I don't care what you do to me now, but because you could not let his murder remain unpunished. I'll tell you the whole story. I lied at the inquest. I lied to my own attorney. And I was going to lie here, but everything I have told you so far has been the truth, and I will tell you the rest.
You had started telling us about Mr. Faulkner's way out of his business difficulties, Miss Andre.
I told you he was going to leave this world, but he was not to kill himself. I did throw a man's body off the penthouse, but that body was dead before I threw it. It was not Bjorn Faulkner.
Will you please explain this to us, Miss Andre?
Bjorn wanted to be officially dead. No searches or investigations were to bother him. He was to disappear. That suicide was staged. He had the plan in mind for a long time. He had kept $10 million of the Whitfield forgery for this. We needed someone to help us. Someone who could not be connected with Bjorn in any way. There was only one such person, Regan.
And what made you believe that Mr. Regan would be so willing to help in such a dangerous undertaking?
Because he loved me.
And he agreed to help you in spite of that?
He agreed because of that.
What was the plan, Miss Andre?
Regan was to get a corpse, but he was not to kill anybody for the purpose. We waited. On the night of January 16th, Lefty O'Toole, a gunman, was killed by rival gangsters. His murderers have since been arrested and have confessed, so you can be sure that Regan had nothing to do with his murder. However, you may remember reading in the papers that O'Toole's body disappeared mysteriously from his mother's house. That was Regan's work. O'Toole's height, measurements, and hair were the same as Bjorn's. That was a man that I threw off the penthouse.
Was that the extent of Mr. Regan's help?
No. Regan was to get a plane and fly Bjorn to South America. Bjorn had never learned how to operate a plane, and, well, Regan used to be a transport pilot. That day, January 16th, Bjorn transferred $10 million to 3 banks in Buenos Aires under the name of Ragnar Hayden. A month later, I was supposed to meet him at the Hotel Continental in Buenos Aires. Until then, the three of us were not to communicate with each other. No matter what happened, we are not to reveal the secrets.
Tell us what happened on the night of January the 16th, Miss Andre.
Bjorn came to my house that night. I'll never forget his smile when he stepped off that elevator. He loved danger. We had dinner together, and then at 9:30 we went to Regan's. He had O'Toole's body dressed in traveling clothes. Then we all drove back to my house. Bjorn wanted to be seen entering the building, so I didn't use my key, I rang the doorbell. We were all dressed formally to make it look like a party. And Bjorn and Regan supported the body as if he were a drunken friend. The night watchman opened up the door and we all went up in the elevator.
And then what happened?
Bjorn exchanged clothes with the corpse. He wrote the letter. And then they carried the body out and left it leaning up against the parapet. And then we said goodbye. Bjorn was to go first. I stood and watched the needle of the indicator moving down, 50 floors down. When it stopped, he was gone.
And then?
Regan followed him a few minutes later. They were to meet 10 miles outside of the city where Regan had left his plane. I stayed alone for an hour. I didn't want to wait out in the garden with the corpse, the dead man that's supposed to be Bjorn. So I laid on my bed in the bedroom. I took Bjorn's robe and buried my face in it. I could almost feel the warmth of his body. There was a clock by the bed and it ticked in the darkness. I waited. When an hour had passed, I knew that the plane had taken off, so I got up. I tore my dress to make it look like a struggle, and then I went out to the garden, to the parapet. I looked down. There were so many lights. The world seemed so small, so far away. And then I pushed the body over. I watched it fall. I thought that all of Bjorn's troubles went with it. I didn't know that his life went too.
That is all, Miss Andre.
I must confess, Miss Andre, you haven't left much for me to do. You seem to have done all my work for me. Now tell us, Miss Andre, didn't Mr. Faulkner have a clear conception of the difference between right and wrong?
Bjorn never thought of things as right or wrong. To him it was only you can or you can't. And he always could.
And you? You didn't object to helping him in all these criminal activities?
To me it was only he wants or he doesn't.
You say that Bjorn Faulkner loved you?
Yes.
Did he ever ask you to marry him?
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
No, what for?
Well, don't you know that there are laws made for situations such as this?
Laws made by whom, Mr. Flint, and for whom?
Miss Andre, did your attorney warn you that whatever you said here may be held against you?
I am here to tell the truth.
You loved Bjorn Faulkner?
Yes.
Such as he was?
Because he was such as he was.
Exactly, Miss Andre. And what would you do if a woman took the man that you worship so insanely, if she appealed to his soul, not his animal desires like you were so successful in doing, if she took the ruthless scoundrel that you love so much and turned him into her own ideal of an upright man, would you still love him?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained, Mr. Flint.
But I want to answer. I want the district attorney to know that he is insulting the memory of Bjorn Faulkner.
Oh, you do you? But you didn't seem to mind insulting him while he lived by an affair with a gangster.
Objection, Your Honor. I will let the sidebar, please.
Your Honor, I would suggest
Tony,
that you tell Mr. Flint.
Tony, sit down.
You're out of order.
Your Honor, I'm having trouble with Mr. Flynn's term gangster. He cannot be using that term in his...
Oh, Your Honor,
Mr. Flint.
there isn't a person in this city
Mr.
under
Flint.
6 that doesn't know what he is.
Mr. Flint.
Your Honor, he's
I'll talk to you.
prejudicing the jury before he even gets up on the stand.
Sustained. Clean up your language, Flint.
You're wrong, Mr. Flint. Regan loved me. I didn't love him.
And he didn't demand the usual price for his help?
Objection.
Overruled.
He demanded nothing.
Now, Miss Andre, you were the only one that knew all the details of Mr. Faulkner's illegal activities, weren't you?
Yes.
You had enough information to send him to jail at any time.
I would never do that.
But you could have if you wanted to.
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
I suppose so.
Isn't that the explanation of all Mr. Faulkner's visits to you after his marriage? He was a reformed man. He wanted to avoid a crash. You held it over his head.
Objection.
You could ruin his plans. You could expose him before he made good for his crimes. And wasn't it fear and not love that held him in your hands?
Bjorn never knew the meaning of the word fear.
Who knew about the transfer of $10 million to Buenos Aires?
Only myself, Bjorn, and Regan.
And Regan. Now, Mr. Faulkner could have had legitimate business reasons for that transfer, couldn't he?
I don't know of any.
You mean that you'll tell us?
Objection.
Overruled.
Now listen, Mr. Faulkner kept you in extravagant luxury for 10 years. You enjoyed platinum gowns and things like that.
Objection, Your Honor.
You hated to see him turn over you hated to change your mode of living. You hated to see him turn over his fortune to his investors. You hated to see him poor, didn't you?
I was never to see him poor.
Of course not, because you and your gangster lover
Objection,
were going to kill him and
Your
take the
Honor,
$10 million
it's clearly
that no one knew about.
Sustained,
You've heard it testified yourself that he had no reason to commit suicide. He had no more reason to escape the first happiness that he ever knew, and you hated him for that happiness.
You don't understand Bjorn Faulkner.
Well, maybe I don't, Miss Andre, but let's see if I understand you. You were raped by a man the first day you met him. You lived with him for 10 years in a brazenly illicit relationship. You defrauded thousands of investors across the world. You cultivated a friendship with a notorious gangster. You aided in a $25 million forgery. You told us all this proudly, flaunting your defiance of all decency. And you expect us to believe that you're not capable of murder?
You're wrong, Mr. Flint. I am capable of murder. For Bjorn Faulkner's sake.
Thank you, Miss Andre. No more questions.
You may step down, Miss Andre. Miss Stevens?
Mr. Regan? Tony Regan. You solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
What is your name?
Antonio Regan.
What is your occupation?
I'm unemployed.
How long have you known Miss Andre?
5 months.
Where did you meet her?
In Faulkner's office. I went up there to do some business with him, but I gave up the business because I met a secretary.
How did you happen to become friendly with Miss Andre?
First time wasn't exactly friendly. You see, she wouldn't let me up to see Faulkner. She said that I had enough money to buy orchids by the pound and I had no business with her boss. I said I'd think it over and left. I thought it over, only I didn't think of the business. I thought of her. The next day, I sent her a pound of orchids. You ever seen how many that makes? That's how it started.
Did you know of Miss Andre's relations with Mr. Faulkner?
I knew it before I ever saw her. What of it? I knew it was hopeless, but I couldn't help it.
You never expected her to share in your feelings?
No.
You never made any attempt to force it upon her?
Do you have to know all
I'm
of
afraid
that?
we do.
I kissed her. Once, by force. It was the night of Faulkner's wedding. She was alone, and she was so unhappy. Well, I was crazy about her. She told me it was no use. I never wanted her to know, but she knew. We never mentioned it since.
When did Miss Andre first tell you of Faulkner's planned escape?
About 2 weeks before we pulled it off.
Was Lefty O'Toole one of your men?
No.
Were you connected with his murderers in any way?
No.
You actually had no definite knowledge of his planned murder?
No. Some say I just had a way of guessing.
Tell us what happened on the night of January the 16th, Mr. Regan.
What all happened is Miss Andre has told you, only she knows half the story. I know the rest.
Tell us what happened after you left the penthouse.
I left 10 minutes after Faulkner. He had taken my car, and I had one of my men leave another one for me at the door. I stepped on it, full speed.
Where did you go?
To Meadow Lane, 10 miles out in Kings County. I had left my plane there earlier that evening. Faulkner was to get there first and wait for me.
What time did you get there?
About midnight. It was a bright moon, and I turned off the road, and I could see tire tracks in the mud where Faulkner's car had passed. Drove out into the lane, and then I thought I lost my mind. The plane was gone.
What did you do?
Well, I searched around the lane for 2 hours. Faulkner's car was there where we'd agreed to hide it. It was empty. The lights turned off and the key in the switch. I saw tracks on the ground where the plane had taken off, but I knew Faulkner couldn't fly it himself.
Did you search for any clues to this mystery?
I searched like a bloodhound.
Did you find anything?
I did. I found one thing, a car.
What kind of a car?
It was hidden deep in the bushes on the other side of the lane. It was a big black sedan.
And then what did you do?
Well, I wanted to know whose car it was. So I smashed in the window and crawled into the back seat and settled down to wait.
How long did you have to wait?
The rest of the night.
And then?
Then the owner came back. I saw him coming. His face looked strange. He had no hat on and his clothes were all wrinkled and grease spotted.
And then what did you do?
Well, I pretended to be asleep in the back seat. I watched him. He approached. He opened the door and then he saw me. He gave a start and he yelled as if he had been struck in the heart. His nerves must have been jittery.
And then what did you do?
Well, I awakened with a start, stretched, rubbed my eyes and said, well, it's you. Fancy such a meeting. I don't think he liked it. He said, who are you and what are you doing here? I said, the name's Tony Regan. You may have heard of it. You see, I was in a little trouble and I needed a place to hide for a while, and finding this car here was quite a convenience. I said, that's too bad, but I have to ask you to get out.
Did you
I'm
get
in a
out?
hurry. No. I stretched and asked, what's the hurry? He said, none of your business. I smiled and explained. You see, it's not for me. It just so happens that a certain columnist is a friend of mine, and Well, he'd appreciate the story of a man of your prominence found wandering in the wilderness at milkman time. But I'm sure he'd like the whole story.
What did the man say?
Said nothing. Instead, he pulled out a checkbook and looked at me. I shrugged and looked at him. Then he said, would $10,000 be a suitable token of appreciation to keep your mouth shut? I said, it'll do. Make the check to Antonio Regan. And he wrote me out a check. Well, I got it right here.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Your Honor, sidebar, please.
Your Honor, I offer this check in evidence.
Your Honor, this is totally without foundation. Are we going to have a verification of the
Your Honor, I
signature?
produce a check in a mere line of questioning. It's obvious why he does not want it entered into evidence.
We will check the verification of the signature.
Thank you, Your
Would
Honor.
you make it It's offered and accepted as evidence.
Who wrote the check, Mr. Regan?
Miss Stevens, why don't you let the clerk read the check?
Would you kindly read the check?
January 17th, paid to the order of Antonio Regan, the sum of $10,000. Signed, John Graham Whitfield.
It's an outrage! Order. Any more outbreaks like this, and I'm going to order this courtroom cleared. Sit down.
What did you do after you received the check, Mr. Regan?
Well, I put the check in my pocket and thanked him. Then I drew my gun and stuck it in his ribs and said, now, you lousy bastard, what have you done with Faulkner? He opened his mouth like a fish choking and couldn't make a sound.
Your Honor, is this man to be allowed to make a statement public in my presence?
You are out of order. This witness is going to testify. If it is proven that his testimony is perjury, he shall pay the consequences. Now sit down, Mr. Whitfield.
What did the man say?
At first he muttered, I don't know what you're talking about. But I jammed the gun harder and said, knock it off. I got no time to waste. I'm in on it, and so are you. Now, where did you take him? He said, if you kill me, you'll never find out.
Did you get any information out of him?
Not a word. You see, I didn't want to kill him, just yet. Then he said, if you expose me, you'll expose the fake suicide and Faulkner will be found. So I asked, is he alive? He said, why don't you go and ask him yourself? I talked and threatened, but it was no use. I let him go. I figured I could always get him.
And then did you try to find Mr. Faulkner?
I didn't lose a second. I rushed home, changed my clothes, grabbed a sandwich in an airplane, and flew to Buenos Aires. When I got there, I searched. I advertised in papers, but I got no answer. No one called at the banks for a Ragnar Hayden millions.
Did you try to communicate about this with Miss Andre at any time?
No. We had promised to stay away from each other for a month, and well, she'd been arrested for Faulkner's murder. I laughed when I read that, but I couldn't say a word. Not to betray him if he was still alive, so I waited.
What were you waiting for?
February 16th at the Hotel Continental in Buenos Aires. I set my teeth and waited every minute of every hour that day, but he didn't come.
And then what did you do?
Then I knew he was dead. So I came back to New York and started a search for my plane. We found it yesterday.
Where did you find it?
In a deserted valley in New Jersey, 100 miles out from Meadow Lane. I recognized the plane by the engine number. It had been landed and set on fire.
Was the plane empty?
No. I found the body of a man in it.
Could you identify him?
No one could. It was nothing but a burned skeleton. But the height was the same. It was Faulkner. I examined the body myself, or what was left of it. I found 2 bullet holes, one in the rib over the heart, the other straight through the right hand. He didn't die without putting up a fight. He must have been disarmed first, shot through the hand, and then murdered, defenseless, straight through the heart.
That is all, Mr. Regan.
Mr. Regan, well, what is your business?
You'd love for me to answer that,
Objection,
wouldn't you?
Your Honor. He has the right not to answer that question.
Sustain.
Now tell me, Mr. Regan, what would you do if a prospective client refused to pay protection?
Mr. Flint, I guess I'm legally allowed not to understand what you're talking about.
Well, you don't have to understand. Now, may I question you as to whether or not you read newspapers?
You may.
Well?
Question me.
Would you state whether you read newspapers?
Occasionally.
Then did you happen to read what happened to Mr. James Sutton Vance, Jr. when he refused to pay protection to a certain gangster? His magnificent country home in Westchester was destroyed by an explosion. immediately after the guest had left, barely escaping a wholesale slaughter. What was that, Mr. Reagan? A coincidence?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained, Mr. Flint. Now, what's your line of questioning?
I would say it was a remarkable coincidence, Mr. Flint. Just after the guest left.
And when Mr. Van Dorn refused...
Objection, Your Honor. These questions are completely irrelevant.
Sustained.
You say that you had no ill feelings towards Faulkner because of the failure of your business with him?
None.
And you expect us, Tony?
Excuse me?
Excuse me. Mr. Antonio Reed, you expect us to believe. Tell us, what would you do if someone took the woman you love so much and raped her?
I'd cut his throat with a dull saw.
You would, huh? And you expect us to believe that Tony Regan, gangster, outlaw, scum of the underworld, would step aside in a grand gesture and throw the woman he wanted so much into the arms of another man?
Honor.
I had nothing to say about that.
You didn't? Why did you, if you loved her so much, why did you allow Faulkner to visit her after his marriage?
I had nothing to say about that.
You didn't? The two of you didn't hold a blackmail plot over his head?
You got any proof?
Her association with you is the best
Objection, Your
proof.
Honor.
Sustained, Mr. Flint.
All right, Tony, tell us, how did you kill Faulkner in the penthouse that night?
Sustained, Mr. Flint.
Where is your other accomplice, the man who played the drunk?
I can give you his exact address. Evergreen Cemetery, Whitfield Family Memorial, which is the swankiest place that poor Lefty's ever been.
Now, let me get this clear, huh? You claim that the body in Evergreen Cemetery is Lefty O'Toole, and the body that you found in the airplane in New Jersey is Bjorn Faulkner.
That's right.
Now, what's to prove it's not the other way around? Supposing you did steal Lefty O'Toole's body, what's to prove that you didn't plan it, that you didn't stage this whole fantastic thing, and come here with this last desperate to save your mistress? You've heard it testify that you'd do anything for her, that you'd lie for her, that you'd steal for her, that you'd kill for her.
Sustained, Mr. Flint.
What's your real proof, Tony?
Mr. Flint, you're a district attorney and I'm a, well, you know what I am.
Oh, yeah.
We both have a lot of dirty work to do. Such happens to be life, or most of it. But do you think that we're both so low that if something passes us for which one kneels, that we no longer have eyes to see it? I loved her, and she loved Faulkner. Now that, Mr. District Attorney, is our only proof.
No more questions, Tony.
You may step down, Mr. Regan. Ms. Stevens,
Your Honor, I'd like to recall Mr. Whitfield.
recall Mr. Whitfield. I must remind you, Mr. Whitfield, you are still under oath.
Mr. Whitfield, would you mind if I had an order to exhume the body buried in Evergreen Cemetery?
I would have no objection, but that body has been cremated.
I see. Mr. Whitfield, where were you on the night of January the 16th?
I believe I was in New York on business that night.
Do you have any witnesses who can prove it?
Miss Stevens, you must realize that I am not in the habit of providing myself with alibis. I have never had reason to keep track of my activities and to secure any witnesses. I would not be able to find them now.
How many cars do you own, Mr. Whitfield?
4.
What are they?
One of them is a black sedan, as you are evidently anxious to learn. I may remind you that it is not the only black sedan in New York City.
You have just returned from California by plane?
Yes.
You flew it yourself?
Yes.
You're a licensed pilot, then?
I am.
Now, that story by Mr. Regan is nothing but a lie in your opinion, isn't it?
It is.
Then who wrote the check?
I did.
Kindly explain it.
It is very simple. We all know Mr. Regan's profession. He had threatened to kidnap my daughter, and I preferred to pay him off rather than take any chances on her life.
The check is dated January 17th. On that same day, you offered your reward for the arrest of Tony Regan, didn't you?
Yes. You realize that besides my civic duty, my daughter's life was at stake, and I wanted prompt action.
Mr. Whitfield, your daughter and your fortune are your most cherished possessions, aren't they?
They are.
Then what would you do to the man who took your money and deserted your daughter for another woman?
Objection, Your Honor.
You hated
Objection
Faulkner. You wanted to
sustained,
break
Miss
him, didn't
Stevens.
you? You suspected his intention of staging suicide. The words that Youngquist heard you say prove it.
I suspected nothing of the kind.
And on January 16th, didn't you spend the day watching Faulkner?
Certainly.
Weren't you trailing Faulkner in your black sedan? Didn't you follow him when he left the penthouse that night?
Fantastic. How could I have recognized him? Supposing it were Faulkner leaving. Van Fleet, the detective, did.
Van Fleet wasn't watching for a trick. He had no suspicion of plot. You had.
My dear Miss Stevens, how could I have known about the plot for that night?
Didn't you hear about anything about Faulkner's activities at that time?
None.
You heard of nothing unusual that day?
Not a thing.
For instance, you did not hear that he transferred $10 million to Buenos Aires?
I never heard of
That
it.
is all, Mr. Whitfield.
Mr. Flint,
No questions, Your Honor.
you may step down, Mr. Whitfield.
Your Honor, I'd like to recall Mr. Youngquist.
Recall Mr. Youngquist. Mr. Youngquist, I must warn you that you are still under oath.
Mr. Youngquist, you have something to tell us.
I killed Faulkner. God help me. I helped Whitfield to kill him. Whitfield killed Faulkner
Your Honor,
because he
may we
lied.
approach?
He knew about the 10 million because I told him.
Sit down, Mr. Youngquist. Counsel's approach.
She's doing it again. She pulling rabbits out of hats.
Your Honor, I merely recalled one of my witnesses.
Was this covered against direct?
You know perfectly well I can go back and
You think-
re-question him and
Would you
establish...
guys do that?
Stop it. I'm going to allow it, Mr. Flint.
You told Whitfield about the transfer, Mr. Youngquist?
He asked me many times about the $10 million, how it was spent. I didn't know it was a secret. And then I told him about that day in Buenos Aires, that day at noon, January 16th.
What kind of a frame-up is this?
Sit down, Mr. Whitfield. You're out of order.
You told Mr. Whitfield about the transfer at noon?
I did. I would give up my life gladly for that man, and I helped to kill him.
That is all, Mr. Youngquist.
Mr. Youngquist, did you testify earlier that you do anything, including lie, for your sake of your master or Miss Andre?
Yes?
Were you alone with Mr. Whitfield when you told him this?
Yes.
Then it's your word against his?
Yes.
No more questions.
You may step down, Mr. Youngquist.
Your Honor, the defense rests.
You're goddamn liar.
You may proceed with your closing remarks.
Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are here to decide the fate of a woman. But much more than one woman is here on trial. Before you pronounce your verdict on Karen Andre, think about your verdict on Bjorn Faulkner. Do you believe he was the kind of man who would bow, renounce, repent? If you do, she's guilty. But if you believe that in this sad, half-hearted world of ours, a man can still be born with life singing in his veins, a scoundrel, a swindler, a criminal, call him anything, but still a conqueror. If you value a strength that is its own motor, an audacity that is its own law, a spirit that is its own vindication, if you are able to admire a man who, no matter what mistakes he may have made in form, never betrayed his essence, his self-esteem, then you will understand Bjorn Faulkner. If deep in your heart you have felt this longing for greatness and for a sense of life beyond the lives around you, if you've known a great timidity which hunger can't satisfy, then you will understand Bjorn Faulkner. If you do, you will understand a woman who is his priestess. Who's on trial in this case? Karen Andre? No. But you. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury who are here on trial. It's your own souls that will be brought to light when the decision is rendered. Thank you.
Mr. Flint, you may conclude this case with your Ending remarks.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, for once I agree with the defense counsel. Two opposing types of humanity are on trial here. And your verdict will depend upon which side you choose to believe. You are asked by the defense to take the word of a swindler, a harlot, and a gangster against a man who is the very model of social responsibility, and a woman who is everything that the ideal of womanhood has been for centuries. On one side, you see a life of duty, selflessness, honor. On the other, you see a steamroller of sensual indulgence and egoistic ambition. I agree with the defense counsel. Let this verdict be cast deep in your soul. If you believe that love is not simply sexual indulgence, if you believe that man was put on earth for a purpose higher than his own enjoyment, if you believe that love is not confined to your bedroom, but that it extends to your family and your fellow man, if you believe that simple, selfless service to your fellow man is still the most sacred ideal that a man can aspire to, then you will believe that simple virtue is more powerful than arrogance, and that a man like Bjorn Faulkner will be brought low before it. Let your verdict say that none shall raise their heads too high in dishonor of our common standards. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the clerk will now escort you to the jury room for your verdict. I will ask you to weigh very heavily all the facts shown in this case and to be very careful about your verdict. Clerk?
Now that the jury has retired to render their verdict after 3 unbelievable days of testimony, we're left to come to our own decisions about this case. What are poignant moments in this case came when the widow of the deceased, Nancy Lee Whitfield, took the stand to describe her life with the gold magnet after having left for refuge in California to testify.
I am ready, Mr. Flint. In August of last year. At home, given by my friend Sandra Van Rensselaer in Newport. Sandra introduced us. I remember she said, "Here's a tough one for you, Nancy. I wonder whether you'll add this scout to the well-known collection." Sandra always insisted on exaggerating my popularity. I danced with him that night. We danced in the garden, under the trees. We stopped by the edge of the pool, with the faint sound of the blue W waltz filling the silence. Mr. Faulkner reached up to the rose for me, and as he tore it off, his hand brushed my bare shoulder. I blushed. He noticed it and apologized, graciously smiling. Then he took me back to the guests. I think we both felt the silent understanding that night. We did not dance again with each other.
This heartfelt testimony was shattered when Miss Andre herself took the stand to defend the accusations against her.
Bjorn met her at a party. She made it obvious that she was greatly interested in him. Then he came to me one day and said, "Karen, we have only one piece of collateral left of your holdings. You're going to have to let me borrow it for a while." I said, "Certainly, Bjorn, what is it?"
That was tough. I asked Nancy Whitfield. He nodded. I didn't answer all at once. It wasn't very easy for me to say. And then I said, all right, Bjorn. Yes, that would change things between us. I said no. Had Mr. Clark...
More and more deception was revealed in the third day of testimony when the real nature of the crimes was revealed.
Mr. Faulkner committed suicide. No. Bjorn Faulkner did not commit suicide. He was murdered. And I did not kill him. Please believe me. I don't care what you think. I don't care what you do to me now. Because you cannot let this murder remain unpunished. I'll tell you the whole truth. I lied to the inquest. I even lied to my own attorney. And I was going to lie here, but everything I have told you so far has been the truth, and I will tell you the rest. Tell us what happened, I told you that Bjorn was going to leave this world, but he was not to kill himself. I did throw his body out of the penthouse, but that body was dead before I threw it. It was not the body of Bjorn Faulkner. Bjorn wanted to be officially dead. No searches or investigations were about him. He was to disappear. And suicide was staged.
The fate of Miss Andre now lays in the hands of the jury, who must decide whether or not she's responsible for the death of Bjorn Faulkner. With the incredible weight of the testimony given by the astonishing cast of characters, ranging from the housekeeper to the president of the Woodfield National Bank, it will be interesting to see who actually will be the most convincing for the jury.
Attention of the court. Will the defendant rise and face the jury? Will the foreman rise and face the defendant? Have you reached a verdict?
We have.
What say you?
We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I thank you. In the name of Bjorn Faulkner.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you very much for your time. I think your fellow citizens should appreciate it too. You are excused. This court is now adjourned.
The verdict is in. Not guilty. But maybe we'll have a statement from the defense attorney. In fact, here they come now. Ms. Stevens, will you have a few words to say to us?
Yes, I'm obviously very pleased about the outcome of the verdict. The jury has spoken, and fortunately, my client has seen justice served here today. I'm also a little bit relieved. I know there is some discrepancy about the behavior of my client. I guess I would just like to point out that the verdict certainly comments on her behavior.
Thank you. Miss Andre, what are you going to do with your life now that you have suddenly been granted this freedom?
Well, I really haven't thought of it. I just want to put this all behind me and get on with my life.
With the absence of Bjorn Faulkner in your life, what do you think will be different in the near future?
Every part of my life is going to be different. I built my life with him, and I don't have him anymore.
Thank you very much. Well, there you have it. John Wilson reporting live, District 1 Courthouse.
Thank you.
District 1 courthouse where the verdict has just come down, and it is guilty. We're waiting for a word from the attorneys now. Mr. Flint, Prosecuting Attorney Flint, what do you have to say to yourself?
Thank you, Leslie. I'm glad you asked that. I am delighted. Obviously, I believe that the verdict was correct, and I think that justice has been served beautifully today. After all, we have put a guilty person away, and I feel comfortable that I've done a small bit in making the streets safer.
Now, with the astonishing evidence that came late in the trial, do you still feel that this verdict is the right one?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think that you can underestimate the intelligence of jurors. It's what's made our system work for centuries, and I think we have to believe them. I don't think they're going to be fooled or tricked by emotionalism or faulty arguments.
And what about you? What are your plans for the near future?
Oh, I'm not at liberty to discuss them right now. I'm going to take a little vacation, and I'm sure we'll have a press conference shortly.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Flint. Hopefully we'll get a word soon from Gail Stevens, the defense attorney. And, oh, here she is now, Miss Stevens. Can we have a word from you?
Well, I'm obviously not very pleased about the outcome. I'm going to appeal the case, for sure. I think, unfortunately, the jury in this case was never really grounded. A lot of emotion and drama in there, and they never really had a sense of the truth the whole time. Second time around, I hope to have a little better grasp of it, a little more control. I have a little better feel of what the witnesses are going to be saying this time around, and hopefully justice will be served.
Well, thank you very, very much. This is Leslie McCormick reporting to you live from District 1 Courthouse.